The morning I found Sharon Hendricks standing at the edge of my property with her phone pointed at my snowmobile trail. I knew my peaceful winter was about to end. I'd been living in Whitefish, Montana for 5 years, running a small outdoor equipment repair business from my garage, and enjoying the incredible access to backcountry trails my 20-acre property provided. My name is Peter Quinn, and I'd specifically chosen this location because it bordered national forest land on 3 sides, giving me direct access to thousands of acres of pristine wilderness. The 4th side, unfortunately, bordered a newer development called Pine Ridge Estates, a collection of oversized vacation homes governed by what I would soon learn was the most aggressive HOA in Flathead County. "Excuse me," Sharon called out, her voice sharp even across the 100 yards of snow between us. "I need to speak with you about this trail." I killed the engine on my Ski-Doo and pulled off my helmet. The cold January air hit my face, and I could see my breath forming clouds as I walked toward her. Sharon was maybe 50, wearing what looked like a designer ski jacket that had never seen actual mountain use, and her blonde highlights were perfectly maintained despite the sub-zero temperatures we'd been experiencing. "What about it?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. I'd seen her around town a few times, usually complaining to some service worker about one thing or another. "I'm Sharon Hendricks, president of the Pine Ridge Estates HOA. She said it like I should be impressed. "We've been watching you pack down this trail for weeks now, and we need to discuss access rights." I felt my jaw tighten. "Access rights to my private property?" "Well, technically, the trail you're making connects to the national forest, and several of our residents have expressed interest in using it for their own winter recreation." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We believe that since you're creating a public amenity by packing down the snow, our residents should have equal access." I stared at her for a long moment, trying to process the sheer audacity of what she was suggesting. "Let me get this straight. You want me to share the trail that I'm creating on my land, using my equipment and my time, because your HOA residents want to use it?" "It's only fair," Sharon said, pulling her jacket tighter. "We're all part of the same community after all. Besides, I've done some research, and there's a Montana law about recreational access that could apply here." She was referring to Montana's stream access law, which I knew well from my years here. But she was either deliberately misinterpreting it or genuinely didn't understand that it applied to waterways, not private property trails. "That law applies to rivers and streams," I said, "not snowmobile trails on private land." Sharon's expression hardened. "We'll see about that. I'm giving you official notice that the Pine Ridge HOA expects access to this trail for our residents. We'll be sending you formal documentation." She turned and marched back through the snow toward the development, her expensive boots sinking with each step. I watched her go, feeling the first stirrings of real anger. I'd dealt with difficult customers before, but this was different. This was someone trying to claim rights to something I'd built on my own property. That evening, I sat in my workshop with my best friend Marcus Rivera, who ran a law office in Kalispell. We'd known each other since college, and he'd helped me with the property purchase when I'd moved to Montana. "So let me get this straight," Marcus said, nursing a beer as I finished explaining the situation. "The HOA president from the subdivision next door wants you to give their residents access to your snowmobile trail." That's exactly what she said. Claimed there was some legal precedent. Marcus laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "She's talking out of her ass, Peter. Montana's stream access law has nothing to do with this. Your property is your property, and you have zero obligation to let anyone else use it." "That's what I thought, but she seemed pretty confident. HOA presidents usually are. They get used to having power in their little kingdoms and forget that their authority ends at their property lines. He pulled out his phone and started typing. "What's the HOA called again?" "Pine Ridge Estates." "Let me look them up." Marcus scrolled for a minute, his expression growing more interested. "Oh, this is good, or bad, depending on how you look at it. Pine Ridge Estates HOA has been involved in 3 lawsuits in the past 2 years. 2 against residents for violations, 1 against a contractor who apparently damaged their entrance gate. They lost the contractor case, settled one of the resident cases, and the other is still ongoing. So they're litigious. Very. And they've got a reputation in the legal community for being aggressive. My partner actually represented one of the homeowners they sued. Said it was one of the most hostile cases he'd worked on, and they threw everything at his client over what amounted to having the wrong color Christmas lights." I felt a knot forming in my stomach. So Sharon isn't going to just let this go. Probably not. But here's the thing, Peter. You're not in their HOA. You're not bound by their rules. And Montana property law is very clear about landowner rights. As long as you're not doing anything that creates a legal nuisance or violates zoning ordinances, they can't force you to do anything. But they can make my life difficult. Marcus met my eyes. Yeah, they can definitely try. The formal letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by certified mail. It was written on expensive letterhead and ran to 4 pages of legal-sounding language that boiled down to Sharon's original demand. The HOA claimed that by creating and maintaining a snowmobile trail that connected to public land, I was creating a de facto easement that gave them access rights. They demanded that I either grant them formal access or cease maintaining the trail entirely. The letter was signed by Sharon and included an addendum listing the names of 12 Pine Ridge Estates residents who supposedly supported the demand. I called Marcus immediately. "This is garbage," he said after I read him the letter over the phone. "There's no such thing as a de facto easement created by just using your own property. They're making up legal concepts." "So what do I do?" "Respond in writing, clearly and firmly stating that you will not be granting access to your private property. I'll draft something for you. In the meantime, document everything. If they trespass on your land, call the sheriff. If they send more letters, keep them. If they approach you in person, try to record the conversation if possible. This is insane. Welcome to dealing with an HOA gone rogue. The good news is that you're not under their authority. The bad news is that people like Sharon Hendricks don't like being told no." I followed Marcus's advice and sent a formal response drafted by him, clearly stating that I would not be granting access and that the HOA had no legal basis for their demand. I thought that might be the end of it, or at least the beginning of a long legal process that would eventually fizzle out. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I came home from a parts run to Kalispell to find 3 snowmobiles parked at the entrance to my trail. The riders were nowhere to be seen, but I could see fresh tracks leading into the national forest. They'd used my trail without permission. I took photos of the sleds, carefully documenting the license plate numbers on the trailers parked on the shoulder of the county road that bordered my property. Then, I called the Flathead County Sheriff's Office and reported the trespass. Deputy Jake Morrison arrived about 40 minutes later. I'd met him a few times around town, and he seemed like a reasonable guy. "So they just rode onto your property without asking," he said as we stood looking at the empty snowmobiles. "That's right." I explicitly told their HOA president that I wouldn't grant access, and my lawyer sent them a formal letter. "This is deliberate trespass." Jake nodded slowly. "The thing is, Peter, This gets a little complicated with snowmobile trails. If they claim they didn't know it was private property, or if they thought the trail was open to public use. It connects directly to my house, I said, pointing to where my workshop was visible about a quarter-mile away. And I've got no trespassing signs posted at the trailhead. Okay, that helps. Let me see if I can track them down. He pulled out a radio and called in the trailer plates. A few minutes later, we had the owners' names. 2 of them were Pine Ridge Estates addresses. The riders came back about an hour later, laughing and talking loudly as they approached. Their good mood evaporated when they saw the deputy's SUV. "Good afternoon, folks," Jake said. "Can I see some identification?" What followed was a lot of protesting, claims that they'd been told the trail was open for public use, and eventually some angry phone calls. One of the riders, a guy in his 40s wearing expensive gear, actually called Sharon right there on speakerphone. "Sharon, we've got a problem," he said. "There's a sheriff's deputy here saying we're trespassing." I could hear Sharon's voice crackling through the phone speaker. "You're not trespassing. We have a right to use that trail. It connects to public land." Jake leaned in. "Madam, this is Deputy Morrison with the Flathead County Sheriff's Office. The trail in question is on private property, and the landowner has explicitly denied access. Your residents are currently trespassing." There was a pause, then Sharon's voice came back, harder now. "This is harassment. We've been consulting with our attorney and we have legal grounds for access. Then your attorney is giving you bad advice, madam. I'm going to need your residents to leave this property immediately, and I'm documenting this incident. If there are further trespasses, charges will be filed." The riders left, loading their sleds onto trailers with a lot of angry muttering. One of them, a younger guy with a fancy GoPro setup on his helmet, turned to me before climbing into his truck. "You know, you're being a real jerk about this," he said. "We just want to enjoy the mountains like everyone else." "Then use public access points like everyone else," I replied. "This is my property." "Whatever, man. You're going to regret this." It felt like a threat, but Jake was right there and just shook his head. "I'd suggest you leave now, sir." After they were gone, Jake lingered for a few minutes, filling out paperwork. "For what it's worth," he said, "you're completely in the right here. But I've dealt with HOA disputes before and they can get ugly. Watch your property, keep documenting everything, and don't hesitate to call us if they come back." "You think they will?" He gave me a look that said more than words could. People who make threats usually follow through in some way. Just be careful. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the younger rider's words. "You're going to regret this." What did that mean? Were they going to do something to my property? Try to sabotage my business? I spent the next day installing security cameras around my workshop and at the trailhead. They were good ones, with night vision and motion detection, feeding to a DVR system in my office. If anyone came onto my property again, I'd have video evidence. The cameras proved their worth sooner than I expected. At 2:30 in the morning, 4 days after the trespassing incident, my phone started buzzing with motion alerts. I pulled up the camera feed and saw 3 figures on snowmobiles riding onto my property. They weren't heading for the national forest, though. They were riding in circles on my trail, deliberately tearing it up. I grabbed my phone and called 911, then threw on clothes and boots. By the time I got outside, they were gone, but the damage was clear even in the moonlight. They'd spent maybe 20 minutes doing donuts and aggressive riding, churning up the carefully packed trail I'd spent weeks maintaining. Deputy Morrison responded again, along with another deputy I didn't know. We reviewed the camera footage together, and the riders' faces were clearly visible in the infrared light. "That's definitely vandalism," Jake said, and I recognized two of these guys from the trespassing incident last week. The third one, I'm not sure about. Can you arrest them? We'll start with citations and a report. Given the prior trespassing incident and the fact that this was clearly intentional destruction of property, the county attorney might pursue charges. I'll need you to come by the office tomorrow to make a formal statement. I spent the rest of the night watching the camera feeds, too angry and wired to sleep. By morning, I'd made a decision. If the HOA wanted to play games, I could play too, but I'd do it completely within my rights. I called Marcus as soon as his office opened. They're escalating, I told him, explaining the overnight vandalism. I'm done trying to coexist with these people. I want to know my options. Well, the good news is you're well within your rights to reroute your trail or stop maintaining it entirely. They don't own it, they don't have any claim to it, and you have zero obligation to provide them with any kind of access, direct or otherwise. What if I rerouted the trail so it doesn't go anywhere near their development? Marcus was quiet for a moment. That's actually brilliant. You own 20 acres, right? And you've got access to national forest on 3 sides. That's right. The only side that borders Pine Ridge is the eastern boundary. So reroute the trail to access the forest from the north or west side of your property. That's completely legal. It's your land, and it removes any argument they might make about the trail being convenient for community access. Can they do anything to stop me? Not legally. You're allowed to develop your property as you see fit, as long as you're not violating zoning laws or creating a nuisance. A private snowmobile trail definitely falls within normal property use for this area. I spent that day mapping out a new route. My property was shaped like an irregular rectangle, with the long side running north to south. The current trail ran along the eastern edge, which was admittedly the flattest and most convenient route to the forest. But I could create a new trail that looped around the northern edge, cutting through a section of young pine trees and connecting to the national forest about a quarter mile from the nearest Pine Ridge property. It would be more work. The terrain was more challenging, and I'd need to clear some brush and small trees. But it would be worth it to cut the HOA completely out of the equation. I started work the next morning. The weather had turned colder, which was actually perfect for grooming a new trail. I used my snowmobile to pack down the initial path, then made multiple runs with a small drag behind my sled to compact the snow properly. It took me 3 full days of work, but by the end, I had a beautiful new trail that wound through some actually more scenic terrain and deposited me at a perfect access point to the national forest. The old trail, the one that ran along the Pine Ridge boundary, I simply stopped maintaining. Within a week, fresh snowfall had covered it, and it became just another stretch of unbroken powder. I thought that would be the end of it. The HOA couldn't complain about access to a trail that no longer existed, and my new route was completely separate from their property. Problem solved. But I'd underestimated Sharon Hendricks' determination and capacity for irrational anger. The next letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. This one was even longer than the first, running to 7 pages. The HOA was now claiming that by abandoning the original trail, I was deliberately depriving them of access that they'd come to rely on. They demanded that I restore the original trail and grant them formal easement rights. If I didn't comply within 30 days, they would pursue all available legal remedies. I actually laughed when I read it. Then I called Marcus. They're claiming I have to maintain a trail on my property for their benefit, I said. How is that even remotely legal? It's not. This is getting into harassment territory, Peter. They're sending you letters full of bogus legal claims. They've trespassed on your property and they've vandalized your trail. I think it's time we went on the offensive." "What do you mean?" "I mean we send them a cease and desist letter, making it crystal clear that any further harassment, trespassing, or contact from them will result in a lawsuit. We cite the trespassing incident, the vandalism, and these ridiculous letters demanding access to your property. We put them on notice that they're creating a hostile situation that could result in legal consequences for the HOA and its board members personally." "Will that work?" "With reasonable people, yes. With Sharon Hendricks." He paused. "I honestly don't know. But it's worth trying before we escalate further." Marcus drafted a strongly worded cease and desist letter that laid out the entire timeline of events, cited the relevant property laws, and made it clear that I was prepared to pursue legal action if the harassment continued. We sent it certified mail to Sharon personally and to the HOA's registered address. For 2 weeks, things were quiet. I started to think maybe the letter had actually worked. I used my new trail regularly, and it was actually better than the old one. The scenery was nicer. The terrain was more interesting, and I didn't have to worry about encountering any angry HOA residents. Then the county inspectors showed up. I was in my workshop on a Thursday afternoon when a white pickup with Flathead County markings pulled into my driveway. 2 men in county jackets got out carrying clipboards. "Peter Quinn?" the older one asked. "That's me." "I'm Dan Schultz, County Code Enforcement. This is my colleague, Tom Patterson. We've received some complaints about your property and we need to do an inspection." My stomach sank. "What kind of complaints?" Dan consulted his clipboard. "Running a commercial business from a residential property without proper permits, environmental damage from snowmobile use, and illegal tree removal." "That's all nonsense," I said, but I let them look around. I had nothing to hide. I'd gotten all the proper permits for my repair business years ago. Montana's zoning laws are pretty lenient about home-based businesses, especially in rural areas, and I'd done everything by the book. As for environmental damage and tree removal, I'd only cleared some small brush to establish my new trail, nothing that required permits or violated any regulations. Dan and Tom spent about an hour checking everything out. They looked at my business license, my zoning permits, and the area where I'd cleared the brush for the new trail. They took photos and made notes. Finally, Dan turned to me with an apologetic expression. "Mr. Quinn, everything looks fine here. Your business is properly permitted, the tree clearing is well within normal property maintenance, and I don't see any environmental damage. The complaints appear to be unfounded." "Let me guess," I said. "These complaints came from the Pine Ridge Estates HOA." Dan didn't confirm it directly, but his expression told me everything I needed to know. "We have to respond to all complaints that come in. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." After they left, I immediately called Marcus. "They're trying to use county enforcement to harass you," he said after I explained what happened. "That's actually a mistake on their part. Making false reports to government agencies can have consequences." "So what do I do?" "Document it. I'll request copies of the complaints through a public records request. If they're demonstrably false and malicious, that's more evidence of harassment that we can use." "This is getting out of control, Marcus." "I know. But here's the thing, you're winning. Every time they try something and fail, they look worse. Every false claim, every baseless demand, it all builds the case that they're harassing you. Just keep documenting everything and don't engage with them directly." I tried to follow that advice, but it was getting harder. 2 days after the county inspection, I found someone had dumped a pile of garbage at the entrance to my new trail. It was mostly household trash, bags of kitchen waste and empty bottles. The smell was horrible, and it took me 2 hours to clean it up. The cameras didn't catch whoever did it. They'd approached from the national forest side, probably skiing or snowshoeing in, and had stayed just out of camera range. But I knew who was responsible. More incidents followed over the next few weeks. Someone spray-painted "Share the Trails" on a tree near my workshop. I found nails scattered on my driveway one morning, clearly intended to puncture my tires. My mailbox was knocked over twice. Each time I called the sheriff's office and documented everything. But without clear evidence of who was responsible, there wasn't much they could do beyond filing reports. Then things took a darker turn. I was out on my new trail one Saturday morning, enjoying perfect powder conditions, when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Someone had stretched a thin cable across the trail at about chest height, anchored between 2 trees. If I hadn't been going slowly and paying attention, I could have hit it at speed and been seriously injured or killed. I stopped well short of the cable, my hands shaking as I pulled out my phone to call 911. This wasn't vandalism or harassment anymore. This was attempted assault, maybe even attempted murder. This time, the sheriff's office sent out a detective along with Deputy Morrison. Detective Sarah Chen was a serious woman in her 40s who'd worked major crimes in Seattle before moving to Montana. "This is extremely concerning," she said as she photographed the cable. "This kind of trap can cause severe injury or death. You did the right thing calling us immediately." "You think it's connected to the HOA dispute?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Given the pattern of escalating harassment you've been documenting, it seems likely, but we need evidence to make arrests. Mr. Quinn, I'm going to be honest with you. This case is getting serious enough that we need to consider more proactive measures." "What do you mean?" "I mean we need to catch whoever is doing this. Are your security cameras covering this area?" "No, this is about a quarter-mile from my workshop. I've got cameras there and at the trailhead on my property, but not out here in the forest." "Then we need to set up surveillance." "With your permission, I'd like to place some trail cameras in this area and possibly have deputies do periodic checks. Someone who's willing to set a trap like this will likely try something else." Over the next week, Detective Chen and her team set up several hidden trail cameras in the area around my new trail. They were the good kind, with cellular connectivity, so the police could monitor them remotely. The trap paid off sooner than anyone expected. 3 nights later, Detective Chen called me at 11 p.m. "Mr. Quinn, we've got activity on the trail cameras. Someone is out there right now, and it looks like they're trying to sabotage your trail again. I've got units responding, and I need you to stay inside your house. Do not go out there." I watched from my window as sheriff's vehicles drove past my property toward the National Forest access point. Then I waited, checking my phone constantly for updates. Detective Chen called me back at 1 in the morning. "We made 2 arrests," she said. "Both subjects are Pine Ridge Estates residents. We caught them in the act of digging a pit across your trail and covering it with branches and snow. It's the same kind of trap that's injured people on hiking trails before." "Who are they?" "I can't give you names yet, but I can tell you that both subjects have been involved in the previous incidents with you. One of them was present during the initial trespassing event. Mr. Quinn, these arrests are going to trigger a broader investigation. I'm going to be looking very closely at the role the HOA leadership played in encouraging or directing these actions." The next morning, I learned that one of the arrested men was the younger rider from the first trespassing incident, the one with the GoPro who told me I'd regret not sharing the trail. The other was a Pine Ridge Estates resident in his 50s, who'd apparently been very vocal at HOA meetings about his anger over my refusal to grant access. The story hit the local news that afternoon. HOA dispute leads to arrests for trail sabotage. Read the headline in the Whitefish pilot. The article laid out the basic facts. 2 men arrested for allegedly setting traps on a snowmobile trail, part of an ongoing dispute over property access with their neighbor. My phone started ringing. Other news outlets wanted interviews. Neighbors I barely knew called to express support or share their own HOA horror stories, and Marcus called with news that was both satisfying and concerning. "Sharon Hendricks is panicking," he said. "I've heard through the legal grapevine that she's been meeting with the HOA's attorney, and they're trying to distance themselves from the arrested men. They're claiming those guys were acting independently, not on behalf of the HOA. But they weren't acting independently. This whole thing started with Sharon demanding access to my trail. I know that, and I think Detective Chen knows that too. But proving a direct connection between Sharon's demands and these guys setting traps is going to be tricky unless someone talks. What do you think will happen?" The 2 who were arrested are facing serious charges: felony assault, reckless endangerment, criminal mischief. They're looking at potential prison time. People facing charges like that sometimes make deals, and deals mean providing information about who else was involved. Marcus was right. Within a week, the younger of the 2 arrested men, whose name was Tyler Brennan, cut a deal with the prosecutor. In exchange for cooperating with the investigation and testifying if needed, he'd get reduced charges. And what Tyler told investigators was damning for the Pine Ridge Estates HOA. Detective Chen came to my house to give me an update. We sat in my workshop while she explained what they'd learned. "Tyler Brennan has provided detailed information about HOA meetings where your situation was discussed," she said. According to his statement, Sharon Hendricks repeatedly spoke about how you needed to be taught a lesson for refusing to cooperate with the HOA. She allegedly suggested that if you faced enough problems, you'd eventually give in to their demands. So she was directing the harassment. Not directly, which is going to make it complicated legally. She never explicitly told anyone to vandalize your property or set traps. But according to Tyler, she created an atmosphere at HOA meetings where your refusal to share access was portrayed as you being an enemy of the community. She'd bring it up at every meeting, complain about it, and make comments about how someone should do something about it. "Stochastic terrorism," I said. "Exactly. She didn't give direct orders, but she created a situation where people felt encouraged to take action. The problem is, that's hard to prosecute. So she gets away with it." Detective Chen smiled grimly. "I didn't say that. We're still investigating, and Tyler has provided information about some specific incidents where Sharon's involvement was more direct. Apparently, she knew about the vandalism to your original trail and actually thanked the people who did it at an HOA meeting. That's not directing the crime, but it could be considered being an accessory after the fact." "What about the other arrested guy, Kenneth Morrison?" "He's not cooperating yet, but his lawyer is putting out feelers about a deal. Kenneth is older, has no prior criminal record, and is facing more serious charges because the pit trap he was helping dig could have caused severe injury. He's motivated to reduce his exposure." Over the next month, the investigation expanded. Detective Chen and her team interviewed dozens of Pine Ridge Estates residents, reviewed HOA meeting minutes, and gathered documentation of every interaction between the HOA and me. The picture that emerged was ugly. Sharon Hendricks had essentially weaponized her HOA against me. At meeting after meeting, she discussed the problem of my refusal to share trail access. She'd encouraged residents to file complaints with the county, which led to the inspection of my property. She'd expressed approval when residents took matters into their own hands with vandalism and harassment. Most damning, Tyler Brennan had recorded several HOA meetings on his phone, and in one of them, Sharon could be clearly heard saying, "If Peter Quinn won't be a good neighbor, then maybe he needs to understand what it's like to have bad neighbors." In early March, the Flathead County Attorney's Office announced charges against Sharon Hendricks. She was charged with criminal solicitation, conspiracy to commit criminal mischief, and being an accessory after the fact to several crimes. It wasn't the most serious set of charges, but it was enough to potentially send her to jail and definitely enough to end her HOA presidency. The Pine Ridge Estates HOA board immediately voted to remove Sharon from her position. They also issued a public apology to me, which was read at an emergency HOA meeting that I was invited to attend. I almost didn't go. Marcus advised against it, saying there was no upside and potential for more confrontation. But I wanted to see it, wanted to witness the end of this nightmare face to face. The meeting was held in the clubhouse of Pine Ridge Estates, a fancy building with timber framing and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountains. About 40 residents were there, sitting in rows of chairs facing a table where the remaining HOA board members sat looking uncomfortable. I stood at the back of the room as the new acting president, a woman named Jennifer Carlisle, read the prepared statement. On behalf of the Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, we want to formally apologize to Mr. Peter Quinn for the harassment and illegal actions that were taken in connection with the dispute over trail access. The board acknowledges that Mr. Quinn was completely within his rights to deny access to his private property, and that the former president and several residents engaged in completely inappropriate and illegal behavior in response to his lawful exercise of his property rights. She went on to say that the HOA had terminated its legal counsel for providing bad advice about the situation, and that they were implementing new policies to prevent this kind of abuse of authority in the future. When she finished, there was scattered applause, but mostly the room was silent and uncomfortable. Several residents looked at me with expressions ranging from apologetic to hostile. Not everyone had learned the lesson. After the meeting, Jennifer approached me privately. "Mr. Quinn, I want to personally apologize," she said. "I was on the board during all of this, and I should have pushed back harder against Sharon's behavior. I knew it was getting out of hand, but I didn't want the confrontation. People could have been killed," I said. "That cable across the trail could have decapitated someone." She flinched. "I know. And I have to live with the fact that I didn't do more to stop it. For what it's worth, several of us have been talking about dissolving the HOA entirely. It's become clear that this organization has more problems than just Sharon's leadership." "That's your choice," I said. "I just want to be left alone to use my property in peace." "You will be. You have my word." I wanted to believe her, but trust wasn't something I was willing to extend to anyone from Pine Ridge Estates anymore. The legal process ground forward through the spring. Tyler Brennan pleaded guilty to reduced charges and received probation and community service. Kenneth Morrison fought his charges, but eventually pleaded guilty to felony reckless endangerment and received a suspended sentence with 3 years of probation. Sharon Hendricks's case was more complex. She maintained her innocence, claiming that she'd never intended for anyone to break the law and that residents had acted on their own initiative. But the recorded statements and testimony from Tyler and others painted a clear picture of her role in creating and encouraging the hostile environment. Her trial was scheduled for late June, But before it could start, she accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit criminal mischief and being an accessory after the fact to vandalism. In exchange for the plea, the more serious charges were dropped, and she received a sentence of 90 days in county jail plus 2 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution for all the damage caused to my property, which totaled several $1,000s between the destroyed trail, the damaged tree where graffiti was painted, and my time dealing with all the incidents. The day Sharon reported to the Flathead County Detention Center to serve her sentence, I was out on my snowmobile trail. The spring snow was getting slushy, and the season was almost over, but I wanted one more good ride before the melt. As I rode through the trees, following the trail I'd carved out to escape Sharon's demands, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not because someone was in jail, though Sharon absolutely deserved the consequences of her actions, but because I'd stood my ground, refused to be bullied, and won. The mountains were quiet except for the sound of my sled's engine. The air was crisp and clean, and the views were spectacular. This was why I'd moved to Montana, why I'd bought this property. Freedom, space, and the ability to live life on my own terms. Sharon Hendricks had tried to take that away from me because she thought her HOA authority extended beyond its actual boundaries. She'd learned a hard lesson about property rights and the limits of petty power. The summer passed quietly. The snowmobile trail disappeared with the melt, and I focused on my repair business, which had actually gotten busier after all the publicity. Apparently, people liked the idea of supporting someone who'd stood up to an abusive HOA. I didn't see anyone from Pine Ridge Estates except in passing around town. Jennifer Carlisle waved to me once at the grocery store in Whitefish, and I nodded back. No hard feelings toward her specifically, but I wasn't interested in being friends. Marcus and I went fishing a few times that summer, floating the Flathead River and catching cutthroat trout under the big Montana sky. Think they learned their lesson over there? Marcus asked one afternoon as we drifted through a quiet stretch of water. Some of them probably did, I said. But there's always going to be people who think their rules should apply to everyone around them. That's pretty cynical. It's realistic, but at least now they know I'm not someone who'll roll over when pushed. You certainly proved that. In September, I ran into Sharon Hendricks in Kalispell. She'd completed her jail sentence and was apparently trying to rebuild her life. She looked different, older somehow, and when our eyes met across the parking lot of a hardware store, she quickly looked away. I felt a moment of satisfaction, but also something like pity. She'd thrown away her reputation, her position, and 3 months of her life because she couldn't accept a simple no from a neighbor. It was a waste, all of it. That October, I heard through the grapevine that the Pine Ridge Estates HOA had indeed voted to dissolve itself. The covenants and restrictions remained part of the property deeds, but there was no more board, no more meetings, no more HOA drama. The residents would have to work out their own problems as neighbors, the way people did everywhere else. When winter returned and the snow started falling again, I was ready. I spent a few days packing down my trail, the good one, the one that wound through the pines and led to perfect access to the national forest. I'd bought a better drag system for grooming, and the trail was smoother than ever. On the first really good snow day in December, I rode out early in the morning, the air so cold my breath froze on my beard. The sun was just coming up, turning the snow pink and gold, and I had thousands of acres of pristine wilderness ahead of me. As I rode, I thought about everything that had happened. The demands, the harassment, the vandalism, the arrests, the trial. All of it because Sharon Hendricks thought she could bully me into giving up my property rights, but I'd won. Not because I was tough or aggressive, but because I'd stood firm on solid ground. My property was mine, the law was clear, and no amount of HOA bluster could change that. The trail stretched out before me, perfect and untouched. My trail on my land maintained by me for my use. Exactly as it should be. That evening, back in my warm workshop with a cup of coffee and the satisfaction of a perfect day in the mountains, I thought about how different things could have been. If I'd given in to Sharon's initial demand, where would it have ended? More demands, more expectations, more of the HOA treating my property as their own. Some people might say I should have been more neighborly, should have compromised, should have tried harder to get along. But being neighborly doesn't mean surrendering your rights. It doesn't mean letting bullies take what isn't theirs. And it definitely doesn't mean caving to threats and harassment. I'd learned a lot through this experience. I'd learned that HOAs could be dangerous when run by the wrong people. I'd learned that documentation and patience could be powerful weapons against harassment. And I'd learned that Montana law really did protect property owners, even against organized groups trying to claim otherwise. Marcus stopped by a few days later with news. "Jennifer Carlisle called my office," he said. "Apparently several of the Pine Ridge residents want to know if you'd be willing to meet with them." "About what?" "They want to apologize personally, and they also want to ask if there's any way you'd consider allowing limited, controlled access to your trail for some of the reasonable folks over there." I thought about it for a long moment. My first instinct was an immediate no. But then I considered the request more carefully. Not everyone in Pine Ridge Estates had been part of the problem. Some had probably disagreed with Sharon but stayed quiet to avoid her wrath. "Tell them no on the trail access," I said. "That's not negotiable. But I'm willing to meet with anyone who wants to apologize in person, and I'll give them information about the public access points they can use to get into the national forest. There are several good ones within 10 minutes of their development." "That's generous of you. It's fair. I'm not trying to keep anyone out of the national forest. I'm just protecting my property rights." The meeting happened the following week at a coffee shop in Whitefish. 5 residents from Pine Ridge showed up, including Jennifer Carlisle. They all apologized for what had happened, and several admitted they'd been intimidated by Sharon's aggressive leadership and hadn't felt comfortable speaking up. One of them, an older man named Robert Chen, told me something that stuck with me. "Sharon moved here from California about 3 years ago," he said. "She'd been on an HOA board down there and apparently ran it like a fiefdom. When she got elected here, she brought that same attitude. A lot of us didn't realize how bad it was until this situation with you. It was like a wake-up call. So that's why you dissolved the HOA, partly. But also because we realized we didn't need it. We all bought these houses for the mountain views and the lifestyle, not to be told what color we could paint our shutters." The HOA had become something it was never supposed to be. I appreciated the honesty, and the meeting ended on a positive note. I gave them maps showing the public access points for the national forest, and we parted on good terms. Life settled into a new normal after that. Winter turned to spring, spring to summer, and the cycle continued. My business thrived, my property remained mine, and I enjoyed the Montana lifestyle without any more HOA drama. Sharon Hendricks moved away from Montana about 6 months after her release from jail. I heard she went back to California, though I didn't know or care about the details. She'd been a problem that solved itself in the end. The property next to Pine Ridge Estates, on the opposite side from me, eventually sold to a family from Colorado. They were friendly people who understood mountain etiquette and property boundaries. We'd wave when we saw each other, but mostly kept to ourselves, which was exactly the kind of neighbor relationship I preferred. 2 winters after the whole mess with Sharon, I was out grooming my trail on a crisp January morning when I saw a snowmobiler stopped at the edge of the national forest, looking lost. I rode over to check if he needed help. "Hey, thanks," the guy said, pulling off his helmet. He was maybe 30, with a friendly face. "I'm trying to find the trail system that heads north. Got a little turned around." I gave him directions and we talked for a few minutes. He mentioned he was renting a cabin in Pine Ridge Estates for a week with his family. "Nice area," he said. "Pretty quiet, though. The rental company mentioned there used to be an HOA, but it dissolved. That true?" "Yeah, it's true." "Good. We almost didn't rent there because of the HOA. My parents have had nothing but problems with theirs back home. Seems like they always attract the worst kind of people." "Not always," I said, "but often enough to be careful," he laughed. "Well, enjoy your riding, and hey, thanks for the directions. No problem. Ride safe." As he headed off toward the main trail system, I sat there for a moment looking out at the mountains. The morning sun was hitting the peaks just right, making them glow against the blue sky. The air was cold and clean, and I could hear nothing but wind in the trees and the distant sound of the other rider's snowmobile fading away. This was what it was all about. Not the drama, not the legal battles, not the satisfaction of winning against bullies. Just this: freedom, solitude, and the simple joy of being in the mountains on a perfect winter day. I rode back to my workshop, grooming the trail as I went, maintaining what was mine and protecting what I'd fought for. The trail was perfect, the snow was deep, and the season was just beginning. Sharon Hendricks had tried to take this away from me. She'd failed. And now, every time I rode this trail that I'd built to escape her demands, I was reminded of an important truth. Property rights matter, and standing your ground is sometimes the only option. The Pine Ridge Estates signs were still visible from certain points on my property, but they didn't bother me anymore. They were just markers of where my land ended and someone else's began. Clear boundaries, clearly respected, the way it always should have been. As I pulled into my garage and shut down the snowmobile, I felt that deep satisfaction again. Not smugness, not revenge, just the simple contentment of knowing I'd done the right thing and protected what was mine. The coffee was hot, the workshop was warm, and outside my window the mountains stood eternal and unchanging. Tomorrow I'd groom the trail again, and the day after that, and the day after that, for as long as I chose to do so, because it was my trail on my property, maintained by my choice. And nobody, not Sharon Hendricks, not the HOA, not anyone, could take that away from me. That was the real victory. Not that Sharon had gone to jail or that the HOA had dissolved. The real victory was that I'd stood firm on principle, weathered the storm, and come out the other side with my property rights intact and my integrity preserved. Sometimes in life, the biggest battles are fought over the smallest things. A snowmobile trail didn't seem like much worth fighting for, perhaps. But it wasn't really about the trail. It was about the principle that your property is yours, and that no one else has the right to take it or demand you share it simply because they think they deserve it. I'd learned that lesson, and I'd taught it to Sharon Hendricks and her HOA in the hardest way possible. But it was a lesson that needed teaching, and I was glad I'd been stubborn enough to see it through. The sun was setting now, painting the snow in shades of purple and pink. I stood at my workshop window, coffee mug in hand, watching the mountains fade into darkness. Tomorrow would bring more snow, more riding, more of the life I'd chosen here in Montana. And if anyone ever tried to take it away from me again, I'd be ready. Because some things are worth fighting for, and property rights are at the top of that list. The story of HOA demanded I share my snow machine trail, so I rerouted it away from their properties, had come to its natural conclusion. I'd won, they'd lost, and justice had been served. But more importantly, I'd learned who I was and what I was willing to stand up for in the end. That was worth more than any trail, any property, or any victory over a petty tyrant. I'd found my backbone, I'd used it, and I'd come out stronger. And the mountains, those eternal Montana mountains, stood witness to it all.